was 17 seconds. That's all it took for Judge Roberts' words to hit like a slap. Women like you belong in the kitchen. The chamber froze, the crowd gasped, and millions watched the air crackle with outrage. What Jasmine Crockett did next would ignite a fire across America. But was it justice served, or the start of an even bigger war? It was a crisp Washington morning, the kind where the cold bites your cheeks, but the sun tricks you into thinking it's warmer than it is. Outside the Capitol, reporters were everywhere, camera crews fighting for the best shot. Inside, the halls buzzed with the low hum of staffers, rushing papers, whispering last-minute strategies. You could feel it in the air. Today wasn't going to be just another hearing. Jasmine Crockett sat in her modest office, coffee in hand, scanning her notes for the 10th time. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mom. "Make us proud." She smiled, slipped the phone into her bag, and exhaled slowly. There was pride in her chest, sure, but also that tight, electric knot of nerves you only get when you know something big is coming. The corridor smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh ink as she walked toward the chamber. From across the room, she caught Judge Roberts' eyes, calm, smug, like a man who thought he already knew the ending. The seats filled, the mics went live, the on-air light blinked red. Jasmine adjusted her blazer, planted her feet, and stepped into the fight. Jasmine wasn't born into politics. She grew up in Texas, in a working-class neighborhood, where you learned early that the rules weren't always fair, and the people with power didn't always care. Her father worked double shifts. Her mother juggled 2 jobs. That's where she learned grit. That's where she learned you don't wait for justice. You fight for it. Before the big stages and TV lights, she was in cramped, overheated courtrooms, defending workers who hadn't been paid in months, standing up for families facing eviction. She'd stare down corporate lawyers in $1,000 suits and still walk out with her clients' heads held high. One young client once told her, voice trembling, "You made me feel like my voice mattered." Jasmine carried that sentence like armor. Gender equality wasn't a debate topic for her. It was her life. She'd been talked over in meetings, underestimated in negotiations, and told she was too ambitious more times than she could count. Every fight she took on was personal because she'd lived the same battles her clients were facing. Across the aisle, Judge Roberts' story couldn't have been more different. Born into privilege, groomed in elite schools, surrounded by old boy networks, he'd spent decades on the bench, dismissing progressive legislation with the stroke of a pen. And he believed, deep down, that the system worked just fine. For people like him, 2 paths, 2 worlds. And in a matter of minutes, they were going to collide under the brightest lights in politics. The hearing that morning wasn't just another political formality. On the table was the Equal Workplace Protection Act, a bill that could finally close wage gaps, enforce anti-harassment rules, and hold corporations accountable. For millions of women and minority workers, it wasn't policy on paper, it was survival. Progressives saw it as a long overdue correction to decades of imbalance. Conservatives called it government overreach and swore it would cripple businesses. The divide was a fault line running straight through Congress, and today the tremors were about to hit. Outside, TikTok activists filmed countdown videos. Inside cable news studios, pundits predicted fireworks before lunch. Hashtags trended before the gavel even struck. Everyone knew this hearing was going to be loud. Jasmine stepped into the chamber, her heels clicking against marble floors polished to a mirror shine. She scanned the room, taking in the rows of faces, some allies, some enemies. And there he was. Judge Roberts, seated at the far end of the panel, leaning back with that smirk that didn't just say, "I'm ready." It said, "I'm not worried." The cameras were rolling, the mics were hot, and the air felt heavy, like it knew a storm was coming. Jasmine adjusted her blazer, squared her shoulders, and took her seat. Would her words be enough to stand against decades of prejudice and the man who embodied it? The gavel struck once, echoing through the chamber. Jasmine leaned into the microphone, her voice steady, firm but not sharp, the kind that made even the most distracted listener stop and listen. She opened with numbers, cold and undeniable. A 23% wage gap for women, 1 in 4 facing harassment with no safe way to report it. But she didn't stop at numbers. She told stories A single mother in Dallas sleeping in her car between shifts because rent ate up her paycheck. A warehouse worker in Detroit forced out after reporting abuse. Each one landed like a quiet punch to the chest. Across the table, Judge Robert lounged back, fingers laced over his stomach. His eyes tracked her, but that half-smile never moved, like he was humoring a performance. Every so often, a slow shake of his head said it all. This doesn't matter. The whole country was watching. A waitress on break leaned against the counter, ignoring coffee burning behind her, eyes locked on the wall-mounted TV. A college debate team crowded around a laptop in a noisy student lounge, whispering about her phrasing. In a quiet living room, an elderly veteran nodded, tapping his cane in time with her words. At the back of the press section, a reporter leaned toward her colleague. "He's going to bait her. Watch." The colleague frowned at Robert. "Bait her? How?" The reporter didn't look away. "You'll see." Jasmine kept speaking, unaware that the calm in the room was paper-thin, about to rip wide open. She was halfway through a sentence when Robert leaned forward, slow and deliberate, letting the silence stretch just enough for every camera to frame his face. His voice cut through the room like a blade, deep and cold. "Women like you should be in the kitchen, not here." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy enough to press on every chest in the chamber. For a moment, nothing moved. A sharp gasp broke from the back row. The moderator froze mid-breath, and even the reporter stopped typing. The hum of the overhead lights felt louder than anything else in the room. Then the wave hit. Phones lit up, screens glowing in the dim chamber, fingers flying across glass. Tweets in all caps flooded the feed, live stream chats rolled too fast to read, and Kitchen for Justice stamped itself onto timelines like wildfire. Jasmine didn't flinch, but her breath drew deeper, slower. In her mind, flashes of memory burned through. Professors telling her she was too aggressive, senior partners talking over her, strangers smirking when she walked into court. She'd been here before, just never with millions watching. Every eye was on her. She could let it slide, finish her prepared remarks, and keep the peace. Or she could swing back and risk turning the hearing into a political earthquake. Robert's smirk dared her to choose wrong. She looked straight at him, and in that moment, he had no idea he'd just made the biggest mistake of his career. Jasmine didn't lean back or look away. She stepped forward instead, the microphone catching the faint scrape of her heel on the marble floor. Her voice came low at first, steady and unshaken. "If I stayed in the kitchen, who would stand here to protect millions of women from people like you?" For half a heartbeat, the chamber froze again. Then it detonated. Applause cracked like thunder, rolling through the room as people in the gallery stood. Some clapped, some whistled, a few shouted her name, and the moderator's gavel was useless against the noise. Robert's smirk vanished. His jaw tightened, the tendons in his neck pulling taut, and his fingers twitched once against the desk. The cameras caught every flicker, the narrowed eyes, the shallow breath, the kind of look that could burn through steel if it could. Across the country, the clip hit the internet within seconds. A teenager in Chicago uploaded it to TikTok before the echoes in the chamber faded. A political page on Twitter posted it with the caption, "Kitchen's closed." Within an hour, views passed 1 million, and the hashtag Kitchen for Justice was trending at #1. Robert leaned sideways toward his aide, speaking low enough to almost be missed by the mics. "She won't survive the week." His eyes stayed locked on Jasmine as if trying to will her into silence. But Robert had underestimated two things, her resolve and the internet. Akrona, the clip didn't just go viral, it detonated. Within an hour, Kitchen for Justice was the #1 trend nationwide. Progressives called it the clapback of the decade, replaying her words with pride. Conservatives claimed she'd disrespected the bench, warning it was a dangerous breach of decorum. The internet had become the courtroom, and everyone had picked a side. TikTok was flooded with edits, slow-motion replays of Jasmine stepping toward the mic, captions in bold white, and soundtracks from Beyoncé to Billie Eilish. Twitter users clipped Robert's reaction, zooming in on the tightening of his jaw, turning it into a meme within minutes. On YouTube, reaction channels dissected every facial twitch like sports commentators breaking down a championship fight. By nightfall, late-night comedy shows were cracking jokes about Roberts' kitchen policy to roaring laughter. But it wasn't just applause pouring in. Thousands of messages came from women across all 50 states, single moms, nurses, teachers, factory workers, telling her she'd spoken for them. "You gave me hope," one wrote. "You made me feel seen," said another. Then came the other side. Trolls filled her inbox with slurs, insults, and threats. Some so specific they made her skin crawl. Her messages became a battleground of love and hate, courage and cruelty colliding in real time. At home, Jasmine sat at her kitchen table, the glow of her phone lighting her face. Notifications buzzed so often the wood vibrated under her hands. She smiled at a note from a young law student in Ohio, then froze at a threat sent just minutes later. Outside, the city carried on like nothing had happened. But in millions of homes across America, people were replaying her words, deciding what side they were on. And deep down, Jasmine knew. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was war. The internet wasn't just talking anymore. It was digging. Allies in Congress started making quiet calls, leaning on staffers to pull Roberts' old voting records. Investigative journalists combed through transcripts, rulings, and committee minutes that had been gathering dust for years. They weren't looking for a quick headline. They were hunting for a pattern. It didn't take long to find one. Again and again, Robert had voted against bills designed to protect women from workplace harassment. He'd blocked pay equity measures, dismissed sexual discrimination lawsuits, and used procedural maneuvers to bury reforms before they could see daylight. It was all there, hiding in plain sight. The first bombshell hit late one afternoon. Activist Maria Lopez posted a grainy video from 2014, filmed on a shaky phone in a closed-door legal seminar. Robert leaned back in his chair, smirking, as a young female attorney nervously presented her case. When she finished, he chuckled and said, "Sweetheart, maybe law isn't for you." The room of men laughed along. Maria's caption was simple: "This isn't new." Within hours, the clip was everywhere. News anchors replayed it alongside his kitchen remark, the two moments feeding off each other like gasoline on a fire. Political talk shows debated whether this was an isolated lapse in judgment or the mask slipping off in public. Podcasts dissected every frame, every tone of his voice, while Twitter boiled over with rage. And the more people looked, the more they found. Old interviews, offhand comments, and a string of court decisions that all seemed to lean in the same direction. The question grew louder by the minute. Was this just one bad comment, or proof that this was who he had always been? In living rooms, coffee shops, and late-night group chats, people were connecting the dots. This was no longer just about what Robert said that day. It was about years of decisions that had shaped lives in ways most never saw. Until now. The deeper the digging went, the uglier things became for Jasmine. Her team began receiving security threats, anonymous calls at all hours, messages with her home address, photos of her car taken without her knowing. The inbox that once overflowed with support was now a mix of love and venom, the latter growing sharper by the day. Even her staffers, hardened by years in politics, were shaken. Late one night, her phone lit up with her mother's name. She hesitated before answering, afraid her voice would crack. "Don't let them scare you back into the kitchen," her mother said, her tone steady but warm. "You were never meant to stay quiet." Jasmine didn't reply right away, swallowing against the lump in her throat. The next afternoon, she met with a group of young women at a community center. Students, interns, first-year lawyers, they'd all followed the hearing, some traveling hours just to see her in person. One of them, barely 19, said, "When you stood up to him, I saw myself up there." Another added, "You made me believe I could be in that seat one day." Jasmine smiled, but her eyes burned. She'd spent the past week fighting off trolls and threats, yet here were faces looking at her like she was proof the fight was worth it. In that moment, she realized this wasn't just about defending herself or even passing one bill. It was about showing an entire generation they didn't have to accept the limits others placed on them. She left the center that day with her resolve harder than ever. The noise, the threats, the pressure, they were nothing compared to the stakes. Sure, and the next hearing would prove just how far she was willing to go. The night before the next hearing, Jasmine's office felt more like a war room than a workspace. Stacks of documents covered the table, coffee cups stood cold, and the air was thick with exhaustion. Her advisors spoke in low, clipped sentences, each aware that tomorrow's session could be the turning point. Daniel Smith, her lead lawyer, stepped in with a folder so thin it almost looked harmless. But inside was dynamite. Official records showing Robert had personally blocked funding for federal anti-harassment programs 3 years in a row. It wasn't rumor. It was his signature, his decision, in black and white. They circled the table, arguing over the move. "If we drop this in the hearing, it'll blow the room apart," one aide said, eyes sharp. Another shook her head. "You risk losing control of the narrative. Press first, then hearing." Jasmine listened, silent, weighing each word. She could see both paths. Save it for the media and control the spin, or go in live and hit him where he thought he was safest, on his home turf, under the lights. The risk was enormous. The reward could be bigger. Finally, she spoke. "We do it live." Her voice was calm, but every person in the room felt the decision settle like the click of a safety coming off. No one left the office that night with any illusions. Tomorrow wouldn't just be about the bill or the insult. It would be about exposing exactly who Robert was and making sure the whole country saw it. Already the chamber was packed. Every seat taken, every camera trained on the table where Robert sat. He leaned forward, voice smooth, painting himself as the victim of political correctness gone mad. He spoke about his decades of service, his respect for the law, and how he'd been misunderstood by a soundbite culture. Jasmine listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. She let him go on, the way a chess player lets an opponent walk into checkmate. When the pause came, she reached for the folder Daniel had handed her the night before. She slid the documents onto the desk in front of her, then pushed them forward so the nearest camera could see. "These," she began, her voice cutting through the low hum in the room, "are official records showing you blocked federal anti-harassment funding 3 years in a row. Your signature. Your choice." Robert opened his mouth to respond. But before he could speak, Senator Hayes, one of his closest allies, leaned toward the microphone. Her voice was calm, almost cold. "For the record, Judge Robert, I can no longer defend your actions." The room erupted, not in applause, but in a stunned, electric murmur. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Murmurs rose, camera flashes strobed against the wood-paneled walls. Robert's jaw clenched, but he stayed still, his eyes darting toward the moderator, then the press. Jasmine didn't give him time to recover. "Mr. Robert," she said, her tone sharp but steady, "this isn't about kitchens. This is about the walls you've built to keep women out." The words landed heavy, echoing in the silence that followed. Somewhere in the gallery, a single pair of hands began to clap, then another, then dozens more, until the room was full of applause that drowned out the moderator's gavel. Robert sat frozen, his defense crumbling in real time under the weight of the evidence. Jasmine leaned back, the folder still open on the table, and waited. She knew the cameras had already captured everything she needed. The moment the gavel struck to adjourn, the headlines were already flying. Crockett drops, bombshell. On Robert blared across breaking news tickers. Political blogs, national papers, and cable networks all ran the same clip. Jasmine sliding the documents forward, Robert's face tightening, the applause swallowing the room. Support poured in faster than her team could track it. Calls from progressive leaders, nods of approval from usually cautious moderates, and even a few conservative commentators admitting she had him cornered. Pollsters began running instant surveys, and the early numbers showed a surge in her favor. Robert didn't wait for the cameras to move on. He gathered his papers in one sharp motion and stormed out of the chamber, ignoring reporters shouting questions down the hall. His aides trailed behind, their faces tight, the sound of his shoes hitting marble echoing like a retreat. Jasmine stood, took a slow breath, and walked toward the double doors. Outside, the cold air hit her first, then the sound. A crowd had gathered, spilling onto the steps of the Capitol. They clapped, they chanted her name, some holding signs they'd scrawled overnight. "Walls fall, justice stands." She smiled, waving once before stepping into the waiting press line. Flashbulbs popped, microphones crowded forward, but in the middle of all that noise, her thoughts were steady. The day had been a victory. No one could deny that. But as the chants echoed behind her and the cameras kept rolling, she couldn't shake the question pressing at the back of her mind. Was the battle truly won, or just beginning? By the next morning, the kitchen remark had outgrown the hearing. It had become a symbol. Talk shows, podcasts, and op-eds dissected it from every angle. For some, it was proof of how far the country still had to go on gender equality. For others, it was the rallying cry they'd been waiting for. Grassroots groups move fast. Overnight, donation links popped up on social media, urging people to help pass the Equal Workplace Protection Act. By the end of the week, the fundraising total had broken records. Small dollar donations pouring in from every state, some as little as $5, others in the thousands. Jasmine's approval numbers climbed just as quickly. Polls showed her favorability up across the board, not just with progressives, but with independents and moderates who respected her composure under fire. Even voters who didn't align with her politics admitted they admired her courage. Cable news couldn't get enough of the story. Panels replayed the moment again and again, her stepping forward to the mic, Robert's expression turning stone, the crowd erupting. Clips of the exchange were now used in college debate classes, leadership seminars, and gender studies lectures. And yet, beneath the momentum, there was a hum of tension. Supporters celebrated, but opponents were mobilizing, framing her as a political opportunist. The lines were hardening, and the fight was moving from headlines to the legislative floor. Jasmine knew the bill's sudden surge in support was both a blessing and a warning. The higher she rose, the harder they would try to knock her down. And with the next vote looming, the real test was about to begin. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against the windows and settled in the corners. Jasmine sat alone in her office, the desk lamp casting a small pool of light. On her laptop, the clip played again, her voice clear, Robert's smirk fading, the chamber erupting. Omani, she smiled at first, the same way you smile at a hard-earned victory. But then her eyes softened, and the tears came before she could stop them. Her mind drifted back. She saw the cramped courtroom where she'd fought her first pro bono case, the mentor who told her, "Your voice will shake the first time. It's what you do after that that counts." She remembered the late nights reading case files until her eyes blurred, the friends lost to political battles, the Naraf birthdays and family dinners missed because she was somewhere defending someone else's fight. A small envelope sat at the edge of her desk, postmarked from a town she'd never heard of. She opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note on lined notebook paper. "Because of you, I know I can be anything." It read in neat, careful letters. At the bottom, in bigger handwriting, the sender's name, Emily, age 12. Jasmine held the letter in her hands for a long time, the paper trembling just slightly. She thought of all the Emilys out there, watching, wondering if they belonged in rooms like the ones she'd stood in last week. She knew now the fight was never just hers. It never had been. She folded the letter, placed it gently in the top drawer, and closed her laptop. Tomorrow the headlines would be loud again, but tonight, in this small circle of light, she let herself feel the weight of why she was still standing. Weeks later, the vote came. Against all predictions, the Equal Workplace Protection Act passed, with bipartisan support. In the gallery, cheers erupted, some wiping away tears as the final tally lit up the board. For a moment, the noise of politics faded, replaced by something rare in Washington: agreement. The signing ceremony was held on the Capitol steps under a clear spring sky. Jasmine stood at the center, flanked by young women, minority leaders, and activists who had fought for this bill long before cameras were watching. Many of them held signs not for protest, but for celebration. The energy felt different, lighter, but still powerful, like the first deep breath after a storm. As the pen scratched across the paper, flashbulbs popped, capturing the exact moment the bill became law. Jasmine glanced around, not at the cameras, but at the faces beside her. She saw determination, relief, and in some eyes the same fire she'd carried into that hearing. The narrator's voice cut in, low and steady. She came to fight for justice and left a door open for millions to walk through. The scene slowed, freezing on Jasmine smiling as a group of young girls crowded in close, one slipping her hand into Jasmine's without a word. The image faded to black, replaced by white text on the screen. Do you believe one voice can change history? Sometimes a single moment of courage to stand up and speak the truth is enough to shift the entire course, not just for yourself, but for millions of others. True bravery is not the absence of fear, but stepping forward even when you know the weight of resistance will fall on you. Are you willing to use your voice and actions to break down the invisible walls that hold others back? If this moment moved you, don't just watch and walk away. Like, share, and let this story reach every corner where change is still needed. Hit subscribe, because the next fight for justice might start with you. Which part made you feel something you can't shake off? Drop it in the comments, because your voice belongs in this conversation. This dramatized story is inspired by real struggles and real people. All characters and dialogue are fictionalized for commentary and education. It is not intended to defame or mislead, but to inspire reflection and civic awareness. Thanks for watching.